Our story today is found in the book of First Kings. Our setting is the northern kingdom of Israel during the time when a king called Ahab sat on the throne. We are told in chapter 16 that Ahab, son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. Now, if you know a little bit about the legacy of Israel's kings during this time, you'll realize that's quite a statement. To do more evil than all the kings that had come before him was quite a feat. But the corrupting leadership of Ahab wasn't isolated to him alone, for Ahab, like many kings, had a queen. Verse 31 says, "And as if it had been a trivial thing for him to walk in sins, he then took as his wife Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal of the Sidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. He set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal that he built in Samaria. Ahab also made a sacred Asherah pole." So King Ahab marries a princess called Jezebel, but Jezebel, we're told, was not an Israelite. She is the daughter of the king of Sidon, which is found in present-day Lebanon, north of Israel, a neighboring kingdom. And Jezebel did not worship the God of Israel, but the gods of her country, Baal and Asherah. Now, if you have visited us here at the house before and followed along with some of the stories we've explored, you might just remember who Baal and Asherah are. We've said that in Canaan, the land area where Israel settled, the surrounding people had many gods, but the father god and mother god, the two head gods, if you will, were called Baal and Asherah. And you might also remember why service to these gods spells such bad news for Israel, including child sacrifices. So, with that in mind, what is happening here in 1 Kings 16 is quite alarming. Jezebel is shown to have a huge influence on King Ahab's reign. For example, she influences Ahab to build a temple for Baal in Samaria. Now, Samaria was the capital city of Israel's northern kingdom, the northern kingdom. So, to break that down, a monument is built by Israel's king to the God of Israel's enemies, smack dab in the middle of the royal city. And the whole country is commanded to worship these gods. Jezebel, in fact, is revealed not only to be a mild influencer, standing quietly in the background of Ahab's rule, but as the story goes on, we discover that she, in essence, is calling the shots. She's pulling the strings at the side of a weak-willed king, and practically, Jezebel is ruling Israel. Now, this development spells trouble for the prophets and priests who serve Yahweh, God of Israel, because Jezebel doesn't only actively establish worship of Baal, but she begins a passionate campaign to hunt down and kill all the prophets who serve Yahweh. She's not only calling the shots, but she's also eliminating the competition. But at that time, King Ahab had a palace administrator, a man called Obadiah. And when Obadiah catches wind of what Jezebel is up to, he does the following. Obadiah was a passionate believer in the Lord. While Jezebel was killing off the Lord's prophets, Obadiah had taken 100 prophets and hidden them in 2 caves, 50 in each, and had supplied them with food and water. Were it not for Obadiah's courageous actions, it could be that all of the Lord's prophets would have been wiped out by the queen. But though some had survived during this time, the prophets were still in hiding for fear of their lives. Again, it's not a good time to be a prophet of the Lord in the land of Israel. And it is at this point that we arrive at the main character of our story today, a man named Elijah. During this period, Elijah is the only active, publicly heard prophet left in Israel. He himself said, "I'm the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets." So the country is full of Baal's prophets, as we read earlier in verse 19, the 450 prophets of Baal, and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. Now, if the country is full of Baal's prophets, that means the country is full of the words of Baal. And that also means the country is not full of the words of the Lord. Despite these odds, Elijah doesn't back down. He continues to appeal to the people almost as a lawyer in court, making his case for them to return to the Lord. And this appeal campaign comes to a crescendo in 1 Kings chapter 18. Elijah challenges King Ahab to a public showdown. He tells the king to gather the people of Israel on a mountain called Carmel. And there he says, we're going to have a showdown, a duel, a contest between himself and the prophets of Baal to decide once and for all whose God really is God, whose God is supreme. Just like in a court case, the lawyer, Elijah, is saying, let's present the evidence to the jury, and then they will decide the verdict for themselves. Verse 20 to 21. So Ahab sent word throughout all Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. Elijah went before the people and said, "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. If Baal is God, follow him." Elijah says to the Israelites, you have to choose. You cannot serve both God and Baal. They are fundamentally opposed to each other. And he says to the people, I will build an altar to the Lord, and Baal's people will build an altar to Baal. Then we will call on God, and the God who answers by fire, he is God. Now, many of you may be familiar with this story of what happened on Mount Carmel, but just so we're all on the same page, in short, the result of this public demonstration is that Baal's prophets call for Baal to send fire from heaven from morning till noon, and no fire comes. And their altar remains untouched by the flame. Finally, it's Elijah's turn. He steps forward to the altar and prays. Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. And the Lord answered. Verse 38. Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. In a stunning public display, the proof of God's supremacy is made clear on Carmel before all the people of Israel. When all the people saw this, verse 39, they fell on their faces and cried, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God." God's actions in this scene have finally broken through to his people, and they have responded. The outcome of the court case is decidedly in Elijah's favor. But despite the positive outcome on Carmel, Elijah's worries are only just beginning, because Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, "May the gods do terrible things to me, if by this time tomorrow I haven't taken your life." Now, we know that the queen's threats are no empty threats, and we know this because of what she's already done. She successfully killed so many others. How many prophets have fallen prey to her hatred already? And so, even though seemingly a moment ago, Elijah had experienced victory on Carmel and seen God's power there, following this threat on his life by Queen Jezebel, we read, Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. Elijah runs from the murderous queen. He runs south, leaving the kingdom of Israel and escaping into the land of Judah. We read in verse 3 to 5. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there, while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. He came to a broom brush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. I've had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors. Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. In these few verses, Elijah's life has just taken a 180 turn. It wasn't easy to begin with. He was so often alone. Now he's hunted, alone, driven out of his home in the wilderness of the desert, and he's clearly at the end of his rope. It's not hard to see that Elijah is incredibly exhausted. He's so worn down, so depleted, feels so lost that he prays that he might die. God hears his prophet and answers. At once, an angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." He looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked on hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank and then lay down again. Verse 7. The angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." So he got up and ate and drank. If anyone here has experienced true exhaustion, depression, or despair, you may have had days like these, where all you can do is sleep and occasionally wake up to eat or drink. And in a touching way, God's angel is functioning as almost a nurse or a carer for Elijah, letting him sleep and occasionally waking him up so that he can eat and drink a bit, taking care, in essence, of his basic needs. What will Elijah do now? He can't return safely to Israel. Where will he go? Verse 8 to 9. Strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. There he went into a cave and spent the night. When we feel lost or confused or alone, what do we often tend to do? Often we return to something which we know is safe, something which is familiar or sturdy. So where on earth has Elijah gone? Verse 8 and 9 says he travels 40 days and 40 nights until he reaches a mountain called Horeb. On this mountain, he finds a cave and spends the night. Why has he traveled to this mountain? It wasn't as if it was nearby. As you can see on the map, he would have traveled all the way down from Mount Carmel, south into Judah, then across the desert, and finally getting down to Horeb. This 40-day walk wasn't an easy trek, so he must have had a very strong reason for wanting to go. After all, if all he was after was a cave to hide in or to find shelter in, I'm sure there was caves closer by. Now, if you know a bit about Israel's history, you'll recognize this place. This isn't just any old desert, nor is it any old mountain. Elijah has gone to Mount Horeb, otherwise called Mount Sinai. Horeb in the Bible is another name for Sinai. Could there be a more monumental place in Israel's history than Mount Sinai? This was the mountain on which God descended in fire from heaven to speak with his people, the place where they heard his voice, the place where Israel was made into a nation, where it all started for them, where God made a covenant with his people, where he gave them their law, their identity, their direction. Now, we said that when we feel uncertain of our future, we often reach back into past certainties, things in our past which anchor us, which give us hope that the future will also be assured. And if an Israelite prophet is feeling lost in his identity or unsure of the future, it would make sense that he would come to Mount Horeb, to Mount Sinai. After all, this was the place where God showed himself to none other than Moses. This was the place God passed in front of Moses and spoke to him in person. Every Israelite knows that Mount Horeb is the mountain where God shows up. Could it be that a bewildered and lost Elijah is coming back to this mountain because he hopes that once again the God of Israel will show up? Well, let's read what happens. End of verse 9. Then the word of the Lord came to him. What are you doing here, Elijah? He replied, I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too. The Lord said, Go outside and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. Now, at hearing this, our ears ought to peak up, because Elijah's certainly did. Those words echo similar words back in Exodus, back when God said to Moses, another prophet, Stand before me, and I will pass in front of you. In Exodus, Moses too was feeling lost. He was uncertain of his ability to lead the people of Israel. And like Elijah, he too was looking for affirmation and certainty from God. And to Moses, God said, I will pass in front of you and you'll see my goodness. And Moses did see the glory of God that day, his glory meaning his presence. Now God says he is about to pass by Elijah. And surely Elijah knows what that means. He knows his history. After all, they're on the same mountain where God passed by in front of Moses. Surely history is about to repeat itself. It seems sure to say that Elijah is about to see something amazing. And so he waits. Verse 11. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. That was quite a show of strength, a wind strong enough to tear apart mountain rock, but God isn't in the wind. And of verse 11. After the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. Another show of great power, which God can produce an earthquake. But he wasn't in the earthquake either. Elijah is still waiting for God to show up. Verse 12. After the earthquake came a fire. Now at least the fire is reminiscent of something familiar, Elijah thinks. Surely God is going to show up in the fire. After all, this is how he showed himself to Moses in the burning bush on this very same mountain. This is how God appeared all those years ago in a pillar of fire to the Israelites. And just days ago, God demonstrated his realness to the people through fire on Mount Carmel. Surely God is in the fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. Well, what now? Nothing is making sense and nothing is happening as it did for Moses on Sinai or for Elijah on Carmel. Where is God? And after the fire came a still, small voice. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice came to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" After all these great and mighty signs, we're told that God is not in the wind, the earthquake, or the fire. But finally, a still small voice comes. And verse 13 says, only at this point does Elijah pull his cloak over his face and goes out and stands outside at the mouth of the cave. Now, back in Exodus 33, when God told Moses he was going to pass in front of him, God said, "There is a place near me where you may stand on a rock. When my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft in the rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will remove my hand, and you will see my back, but my face must not be seen." Now, any good Israelite knew very well that when God comes by, you cover your face. And so Elijah's actions clearly reveals to us that he knows what that still small voice means, because he covers his face with his cloak, and only then does he go outside. He knows that the voice means God is there because he recognizes it. With covered head, he goes out of the cave to face God. And God repeats the question he's asked him earlier. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Now, perhaps at this point, Elijah is wondering what God is doing asking that question. Firstly, God is God. Do you really not know why I'm here? And Elijah has already answered that question, so why is God asking again? Well, in response, Elijah gives word for word the exact same answer as he did back in verse 10. He replied, "I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." The Lord said to him, "Go back the way you came, and go to the desert of Damascus, and anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, to succeed you as prophet." In 1 Kings chapter 19, we find a story of a prophet who has seen great wonders done by God in his lifetime, as well as knowing of the great things God has done in the past in the history of his people. And in a period of great despair, of feeling lost, feeling in need of assurance, Elijah returns to a place pregnant with the history of God's mighty works, a place where all Israelites know that God shows up. In fact, you might call Horeb a sort of museum. You walk in, you buy your ticket, you grab your guidebook and take a tour. You walk past the dinosaurs, the Egyptology collection, and end up finally at the Horeb exhibit, this historical landmark. Lining the walls are paintings of the Ten Commandments, the burning bush, and you can get a 3D replica of the tabernacle as a keychain in the gift shop. As Elijah arrives on Mount Horeb and he buys his museum tickets, perhaps he's thinking, maybe Moses, a great hero from our history, sat on this very rock I'm sitting on. Maybe he slept in this very cave. Perhaps the stone face I'm touching with my hand was where God carved out the tablets for the covenant. Perhaps this was the cleft where God hid Moses with his hand. Maybe that bush over there was the one God burned in. Maybe this was the exact place God's glory passed by. It's enough to give you goosebumps. And like in a museum, Elijah is walking through these halls, hoping that history will repeat itself, that the security of what happened in the past will serve as a blueprint for the future. He seeks out the familiar in a place haunted by Israel's past. It's very easy for us to build a mental or physical shrine at the last time or place that God has showed up in our lives, or that God showed up in history. Almost like building a museum around what happened in the past and then binding God to that museum and saying, you can't exist outside this space or act outside this pattern. And if I go to this same place and pray the prayer I did back then with the exact same words, if I wear the same clothes, if I act in the same way, eat the same food, take the same steps as I did, then God will act exactly the same as he did that time. The problem is, this all ends up sounding a lot like superstition or a magical ritual. Boil these herbs in a pot, say these incantations, spit on the ground and turn around 3 times, and you'll conjure up God. But can God be conjured up or controlled? He cannot be more powerful than us and yet be under our control. Was there really anything magical about Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb? Were these rocks holier than other rocks? You know, even today, Christians from all over the world will travel to certain locations that showed up in Christian history. And in a type of holy pilgrimage, they'll go there and hope somehow to connect with God through, well, through what? Some travel to Rome to touch certain stones, others travel to Israel. You'll be able to see lines and lines of tourists waiting for hours in the hot sun just to get a chance to touch rocks on the beach of the Sea of Galilee, or to pray at the Western Wall, or walk down the Via Dolorosa, or view the temple in Jerusalem where God's presence once dwelled. Or perhaps we can bring these examples a bit closer to home. Some believe that worship is only valid if we meet in this particular building at 11 o'clock in the morning and the program looks a certain way. And we can only sing from this hymn book and read this Bible version and say these words and belong to this group for God to hear us, for God to be with us. Horeb, Galilee, Jerusalem, God did do great things there in the past. And perhaps great things happened in certain times and locations in your own life and in the history of the church as well. But are these places magical? Are they meant to be the full breadth and width of our understanding and relationship with God? Are there times when perhaps we try in vain to treat God himself like someone who can be contained within a museum, behind glass, like we can manipulate him into showing up? Is he not God of everything? Is he not everywhere? Need we not simply ask for him to be with us? And this is why God asked Elijah that question, twice in fact. What are you doing here, Elijah? It's not that God didn't want a visit from him, but Elijah, if you seek me, what are you doing in this museum when I am wherever you go? Next to you all the time. What are you doing here? And yet here is the beautiful twist to this story. Despite Elijah's misinformed conjuring attempts, despite him wrongly thinking that God would be more present in one place or another, God still showed up. He still comes to his discouraged prophet. He still speaks to him. He still gives him direction for the future and hope. He showed him, I'm still with you. Perhaps some of us here today are longing for a time when we felt closer to God. Perhaps we hunger to recapture an experience where we felt like things were clearer, when we felt inspired or excited about our faith, or maybe just didn't feel so deathly exhausted. The comfort of Elijah's story is this: you don't have to come to Horeb or Carmel or Jerusalem or Battle Creek, Michigan. You don't have to worry about trying to recreate or simulate what happened in your life in the past or the lives of others. Yes, we can be inspired and comforted by how God acted in the past, but without trying to rigidly reproduce its settings. That's why we share these stories here at the house, this history, like this story we explored in the past in 1 Samuel 7 about Ebenezer's, where we looked at the power of remembering the past to assure us of the future. But God says, I'm the all-present God, the dynamic God. I'm not stuck back in the past. I am always. Even if your life changes and the world changes and you change, I will still be there. In a still small voice, I will come to you, present in your life, even if you feel lost or alone or disoriented. And you don't have to go to a museum to find me or to reenact past experiences. You don't have to worry about trying to return to a time in your life when I felt close or you were inspired to seek me. And you don't have to be who you were back then. God says, I will meet you, even if it is in the wilderness of your despair. Even if it's just to send a messenger to wake you up now and then and remind you to eat and drink. Come, let's move forward together. Let's make new stories because I will be there in those too. I will show up, just like I did on Mount Horeb.
So in my confusion, I stumble through the desert, pining for a signal that you're close and you are there. I seek out the familiar, those high and holy places. In the days I seek you, will you come like you did then? But the wind split the rocks above, and the mighty earthquake tore the ground. So I climb Mount Horeb, where you burn a bush for Moses. Upon the ground of Sinai, I am haunted by those tales. I figured if I revisit those old familiar places, the God of the heavens might show up like he did then. But the wind split the rocks above, and the mighty earthquake tore the ground. Like a fool devising, I thought I could control you, conjure up your presence like a puppet on a string, as if the Most High could be captured in a museum. Is he not the Lord of every place and everything? And the wind split the rocks above, and the mighty earthquake tore the silence.